Okay. So good evening, everyone. Let's get started because it's 10 past now. We want to keep to time. I just want to thank you all for coming to the launch of this really exciting book. We're going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes about the book, Luke and I, obviously mainly Luke, and then we'll have around 20 minutes at the end for any questions from you guys. We'll just ask you to type your questions into the chat directly to me, if that's possible, and then we'll take as many questions as we possibly can. So as I'm sure many people who are watching this are aware already, Luke's been doing this work on deporting Black Britons for a very long time. Some of you may have seen his articles, his blogs, you might have seen his public talks, you might have listened to his brilliant Deportation Disc podcast, or you might be lucky enough to be one of his students or friends or comrades. But this book, Deporting Black Britons, got a copy right here, does something more than it's greater than the sum of the parts, I think, of the talks and the blogs and the other things that Luke has been doing over the years. It provides some really rich portraits of people's lives, some truly vivid descriptions, which not only help us to understand the very different people, the four people that Luke follows and works with and learns from, who had been deported to Jamaica, but also helps uses those stories to help us to understand the history of Jamaica, the political economy of Jamaica, to conceptualize racial capitalism and state racism and violence and the border regimes and the police system. And so not only does it provide a really beautifully written, rich set of stories to read and understand and learn, so does some vital political and conceptual work as well. And I think it makes it all the more enjoyable to read that it's displayed and articulated through the stories of four very moving and profound individuals. So, as I'm sure many of you are already aware, the UK's hostile environment and anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies and panic is something which is all over the newspapers these days. But what Luke's book does, it seeks to challenge us a little bit further. It talks about not the kind of quote-unquote good immigrants, whether they be the so-called Windrush generation or asylum seekers and refugees, but instead interrogates the question of so-called foreign criminals, and the idea that these people are people who have broken quote-unquote our rules and therefore deserve to be deported. And so what he does is look through the stories of four young black men who've experienced this type of criminalization and then exile from their homes here in Britain, and thinks through the ways in which not only deportations and immigration detention and exile affect their lives, but also a range of other issues as well, whether it be poverty and economic inequality, whether it be policing and racism, whether it be separation from family life and interpersonal problems or homelessness, a whole range of different things. And so I think what's really important about Luke's book is that it makes a vital intervention in which far too often we talk about policing and prisons separately, and Luke doesn't allow us to do this. Too often we talk about prison and immigration detentions separately. Luke won't allow us to do this. And he also thinks through, therefore, anti-racism and migrant solidarity together as two concurrent forms of resistance which have to be married if we're going to effectively resist the kinds of problems that are raised in this book. So the book's mainly an ethnography. As I mentioned, it's based on 4 years of worth of research, following not only four people deported to Jamaica, but their friends and their families, both in Jamaica and here in the United Kingdom. But and these four portraits begin the book, but then they're followed by a deeper analysis and an account of their friends and families that they leave behind in Britain, but also work to use the context of deportations to Jamaica to analyse the political economy of developments, the kind of development work that Britain does, which is more interested in security around resources and economies and borders than it is with enabling lower income countries to better their economic circumstances. Luke uses the book to better understand the history of colonialism and the legacies of slavery across the Caribbean as well. And so by using these stories, as I mentioned before, Luke helps us to better understand both the histories of Jamaica and its relationship with Britain, but also the wider global context of racial capitalism and state violences. So as many of you are aware, Luke is a brilliant academic and writer, and he currently works at the University of Manchester. And I think we should probably begin by asking probably the most basic question. Why deportations to Jamaica? Why did you write this book, and what do you hope people are going to get from it?
Thanks for that introduction, Adam. It's really nice to have people start reading the book, and especially, yeah, as you say, other people working on anti-racist issues, for you to draw out those connections in that way. It's really nice to hear. So thank you. So to write the book, the reason was, I suppose I'd done a master's and I'd done a number of courses on race and racism throughout my higher education, but I was doing my master's and did a project on the deportation of, or the production of foreign criminals in the media. So I'd looked at how people who'd lived in the UK for a long time mostly were being deported through particular representations of them as bad migrants, criminals, often as failed asylum seekers. And so I've been thinking about this in the kind of realm of discourse and media. At the same time as this, I've been working with a refugee centre in Bristol, and I've been hanging out with people in the asylum system and other people who were undocumented migrants. And one of the kind of most jarring things that I experienced there was going to sign with people when they have to report to the Home Office or to a police station, and going with them there and seeing that kind of way in which people experience the threat of detention and deportation got me particularly interested in the grisliest end. As someone who's kind of anti-racist, who'd worked with migrants and who was concerned about the literature and writing on migration and racism, I thought deportation and detention were places where both as activists and as scholars we should be putting our work, and a lot of people are in the same position and do the same kinds of work. And so then I'd realized effectively that what happened in 2006 was a number of the Home Office policy changed after a kind of foreign prisoner scandal, it's called. So there was a scandal about foreign prisoners being released from prison without being considered for deportation. And that led to a whole change of policies, which meant that in UK detention centres, they went from a kind of new population emerged as a new kind of substantive group in detention, which was people like the guys in this book, people who'd been in the UK for a long time, been interacted with the criminal justice system, perhaps spent some time in prison, and then the Home Office were prioritising their removal. And I think this group's really interesting and important to think about, not only because if we're going to really dismantle racist borders, we need to start with and always not exclude kind of bad migrants and people who aren't seen as deserving or having contributed, but because there's a kind of vibrant literature and set of work on racism in prisons, in the criminal justice system, in schools, and then a set of literature on what happens in the migration regime in terms of immigration controls and policies around that, and not enough connecting the two. And I sort of felt like the stories of some of these people who were deported after growing up in the UK and experiencing criminalisation were a good way in to a kind of radical analysis of kind of anti-immigration sentiment and where that ends. So that was the kind of idea theoretically. And then I went to Jamaica. I managed to organise for my PhD work. I managed to organise a kind of placement there with an organisation that works with deported migrants, an organisation of deported migrants. And I got in touch with them, started thinking about what it would mean to do it in Jamaica, and that kind of came together as a research plan. And then from there, of course, so many different questions emerged, as you mentioned in the introduction, about the history of Jamaica, about legacies of slavery and colonialism, and about the ways we can think about them in relation to stories of deportation. And so the final point of your question was about what I hope people will get from it. I think starting to build some of these connections, so not only kind of thinking with people's stories and like me, bearing witness to these kinds of stories, but starting to make connections too about how racism works in the UK and how, as you put it better than I have in the introduction, how we can't think about the racism that we know of around policing and criminal justice as separate from the racism that we know involves people dying in the Mediterranean Sea or being detained in Brook House before being deported back to other countries in Europe, for example. So trying to make these connections, which seem especially important now as the energy builds around policing and around the struggle for Black lives.
Brilliant. So I guess one of the most illuminating things about the book is the fact that you're able to paint a picture of the lives of people once they've been deported. For us, many people living in Britain at least, once people are deported, or the intention is for them to disappear. And you refuse to allow those people to disappear. Can you talk a little bit about how what it's like for people once they've been deported, and what kind of problems they faced, and what you learned from the people that you met once who had been deported to Jamaica?
Yeah, thanks for picking up on that. I suppose that was the main reason for designing the work in this way of going to Jamaica first and meeting people there, is because people are effectively disappeared. And I know a lot of people who are activists and who are lawyers, good lawyers, and who really wonder what happens to people, but there's no kind of way for them to keep in touch in most cases. So I think that was part of the value of the project, and using a PhD for this, like you would in a kind of documentary or good investigative journalistic piece, to try and actually just make visible what has been invisibilized by the state. So, and there is a bunch of literature in the US that does that on post-deportation kind of work, but not very much in the UK. So that was the beginning. That was the beginning of it, thinking that work's valuable. The things people face are really mixed, I suppose, but the difficult things are people are often deported from the UK as a kind of routine, as a matter of routine, who don't have any family in Jamaica. We can talk more about that, but whose family remain in the UK or perhaps have migrated elsewhere. And so when they're deported, it's more like banishment, or we can think of it in terms of relation to banishment and exile, rather than what the Home Office would call it, which is a return, an enforced return. It's more of an arrival than a return. So I would say that that's one of the quickest ways to describe what people experience. They experience it as an arrival, and they experience it as an arrival often with very little in terms of money or support or knowing where to go. Some people do have family there. Some people call family friends and get someone to pick them up from the airport. Some people, might connect with a parent again, but it really varies. But what's common, I suppose, is both a sense of disorientation and kind of social isolation, a desire to contact. I mean, as understandably, to spend all your time contacting loved ones back home. Often people are deported by children in the UK, British children. So there's a lot of kind of disorientation and social isolation, and then practical things around where do you get money from? How do you collect money if someone's going to send you money from the UK? If you don't have an ID yet, you can't pick up money from Western Union, so you have to get someone, you have to know someone. You might be back in with your auntie or uncle or your grandma, and there might be some strained relationships because people are, living difficult lives, and there's some tension there. Some deported people are quite stigmatized as people who kind of had an opportunity and wasted it. But again, the reception is really variable, and people have to find ways to build human connection so that they can navigate what is an incredibly difficult kind of arrival. And then finding work is incredibly difficult, stigmatized for your accent. I mean, if you can't speak patois well anymore, or you can a bit, but you still sound British, which is true of the guys in this book and a lot of people I met, it's fairly obvious. And in the most extreme circumstances, homelessness. So if you walk down Duke Street in central Kingston, you can hear a lot of American accents and sometimes British accents, and people who are street homeless and clearly have been deported after a long time living outside of the island. And in some cases, people aren't able to survive either on the street or for other reasons. And so it kind of ranges from a lot of different things, but from kind of reintegration with family and friends and trying to rebuild to homelessness and death in some instances. Most people are somewhere in between, and along that path involves, struggle, poverty, and an attempt to find ways to survive and rebuild.
I'm going to read the book backwards a little bit, because you begin with these really, illuminating portraits, and use that to help us to better understand global racial capitalism and the history of Jamaica. So maybe we could talk a little bit to start off with about how these deportations can help us to better understand the legacies of slavery and colonialism in Jamaica.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing was, I suppose, for me going there, I got a real education and a real lesson in thinking about these legacies, because we couldn't, I mean, intellectually in the university, these conversations are live, but there was nothing better than actually just living there for a bit and chatting to people, and not so much deported people necessarily, but also people in taxis, people I met, and just had conversations with about why I was in Jamaica and what I was doing. And I felt there was a real, and I write this in the book, a real different common sense around history and its relationship to the present in Jamaica than in the UK, almost the opposite. So we have surveys here where, you know, more than half of British people are nostalgic in some way for empire, or think empire was a good thing. In a Jamaican context, you get a lot of kind of invocations of slavery, and how people are still in a state of slavery, or people are still in a state of sufferation, which is connected to that history and what remains the same about that history. Of course, when you spend time in Jamaica, not only do people invoke slavery and think about their own, so they tend to people who I met tended to be to find it quite easy to make connections between deportation, for example, between visa issues, between the cultures of migration in Jamaica, between remittances and these and tourism, and the history of, for example, plantation slavery and the colonial legacy. So I found that really instructive, and so that's the first thing to say. People kind of taught me that, and when I did spend time there, you know, it's quite hard not to see the ways in which that island, economically and socially, is still structured by the plantation. So what I mean by that is, you have an island in the middle of the Caribbean that was developed solely to produce first sugar and then bauxite, which is what you make aluminium from, and bananas, and now tourism as a kind of export, which the economy totally relies on. And so you can still see those strained kinds of lack of sustainable ways of feeding people on the island, huge amounts of debt, enforced austerity, massive corruption. So all of these, and there's a complicated story to tell about that, but there's also the kind of the easy way to summarize it is to say that in Jamaica, it's quite clear that people's poverty, people's immobility, the fact that they can't migrate easily, and that the country's debts and the country's economic standing, and the way the political works with that economic set of structures, is clearly a legacy of slavery and colonialism. And one of the ways, I suppose, I found that useful to think about is in terms of who gets to move and how. So if colonialism itself was a project of moving people and things around on a global scale to where they're seen to be most useful to Europeans, so moving people to where labour is needed, displacing people, moving kind of flora and fauna as well around to where you want to then build plantations, for example. We can see that today. We can see some of the legacies with that today in terms of who is allowed to move and who is forced to stay and who is forced to return. And so I write that a bit towards the end of the book about how those patterns in how things are made to move and how people are made to move or stay put, that are definitive of colonialism, are also definitive of our present now, but in a different way. And that might be one of the ways we can think about how race works and how racial hierarchy and racial difference is produced. So yeah, mobility was a useful way for me to think through some of the legacies.
And I guess connected to the forced movement or the forced immobilities of people, of course, are the often state actors, right? Whether it be the development agencies such as DFID here in the United Kingdom, and their relationship with Jamaica and the kind of agreements they have in relation to borders and security. Can you talk a little bit about how it is the development sector plays a key role in this kind of border regime that you've been researching?
Yeah, so one of the things I found in Jamaica when I was there was that the organisations that do offer support to deported migrants were mostly funded through the UK's aid budget. So that was a homeless shelter in East Kingston. The organisation that I worked with, NODM, the National Organisation of Deported Migrants, while it was its own organisation, its contract to do all the work it was able to do, picking people up from the airport, helping them get national ID number, and helping them clear customs and offering other kinds of advice, was all being funded by the British government. And actually, one of the professor who was part of setting up the National Organisation of Deported Migrants wrote a paper calling it a pact with the devil, and talked about the tensions between wanting to do something for deported migrants in the Jamaican context, but only finding a way to have done that through this contract with the UK government, with the Foreign Office. So that was news to me again, you know, to try and go back and trace the story of all that time ago when I first went in 2015. That wasn't what I expected to find necessarily, which raises a whole bunch of questions about why the UK. So the United Kingdom government would deport someone who's clearly been in the UK since they were, say, 2 or 5 or 10 or 14, who's been at school in the UK and has no family in Jamaica and expresses that in their application. They would deport them. And so the question of why they would then fund the organisation to collect them at the airport so that they're not immediately left as soon as they come out of the airport, why they would fund the organisation to offer some advice and help them get a TRN, which is like a national insurance number, and then funds the homeless shelter that accommodates some deported people for some time, became clearer when you realised that they use the presence of these organisations in the actual correspondence and the justification for deporting people. So you'd see these organisations quoted in Home Office decision letters, basically saying, you know, we understand that you, individual X, don't have family there anymore, but you know, you're a young adult, you're a young man, and you'll be able to find work. And if you can't, you know, readjust straight away, then there's these organisations to help you. So there was this kind of total and quite insidious set of arrangements between the British High Commission in Kingston and the Ministry of National Security in Jamaica and these local NGOs, and none of whom are necessarily acting out of ill will in terms of the Jamaican authorities and the NGOs. And often when I did speak briefly with the British High Commission, they kind of saw it as a humane set of arrangements. And in practice, it was in some ways to have someone to pick you up from the airport and to have a homeless shelter that accommodates people who've been deported. But in the wider scheme of things, you see how deportation is kind of relying on these set of quite troubling arrangements where aid and development get repurposed in this kind of blurry humanitarian, but also bordering set of practices by both governments. And so once I started thinking about that and reading about that, you know, it became clear that this is a wider pattern. And if anyone people will probably be aware of the kind of EU's policies with regard to states in Africa and the Middle East, which involve the same kinds of things, effectively what I've called strategic humanitarianism, what other people have called compassionate repression, but effectively channeling it, what is an incredibly aggressive and global kind of regime of controlling people's movement with tentacles everywhere, controlling them through various NGO initiatives, but also through funding the police and the border officials in different states like Niger and Mali, and in Ethiopia and Libya. Of course, people will be aware of the nightmares in Libya that come partly through funding from Italy and EU. So then there's this wider pattern where Open Arms, which is the homeless shelter in Jamaica, and the National Organisation of Deported Migrants, the people I'm talking to or observing in Jamaica, are kind of be situated in this wider pattern where states in the global north are using development funds, aid funds, and the language of humanitarianism, care and protection to justify quite extreme and unprecedented forms of control on people's movement that work through interstate kind of activity, through massive surveillance, through databases of the like of which have never been seen before. And that sums up EU policy. And we can see this with Priti Patel, mourning the loss of someone's life who drowns in the channel, by saying, that the problem here is the smugglers and the traffickers. And so what we need to do is, take a tough stance against them, because we're the ones who care. We're the ones who care. And if only the traffickers would stop, then we'd get to protecting our borders and somehow caring about people, saving them by stopping them moving. This kind of logic is there and is part of the story in what I found in Jamaica.
It's almost as if I guess Britain providing the kind of social and welfare infrastructure for people they're deporting that Jamaica isn't able or willing to provide is it's almost a civilizing mission in one way or another, maybe. So the book itself is titled Portraits of Deportations to Jamaica, or subtitled. So what are portraits? They're not painting us a physical picture. Why portraits? And why are they so important, do you think, for your type of research?
It's a good question. I mean, I think I was reading a bunch of stuff about how to do, when you're doing a PhD or a master's project, you read about methodology, and I ended up finding myself in an anthropology department, even though my supervisor wasn't an anthropologist. So I wanted to do something like ethnography. And so first, it's worth saying what ethnography is. And it's kind of the method where you define not by arranging interviews, but by informal conversations, getting to know people well, deep immersion, the kind of cliches of sort of hanging out on a street corner, or the kind of colonial anthropology of, pitching up a tent by the quote unquote primitives is the kind of tradition of where ethnographic methods come from. But I would say the easiest way of describing it is Clifford Geertz called it deep hanging out, which I quite like as a description of what ethnography is about. Getting really immersed in and hanging out with people because you think that might be the best way and the most useful and respectful way to do research, not to kind of arrange an interview and then disappear, but to kind of become, in my case, become part of people's lives and to have enduring relationships, which partly explains why there's only 4, because that was, for me, ethically and practically, I could honor that and keep up with that. To maintain this relationship. So I've spoke to most of the people in the book in the last week, for example, whereas that would have been harder with more. And portraiture, I suppose, came from reading different work. The work of Les Bach in particular, who's a sociologist who I like a lot, had spoken about portraiture. The thinking for me was, if you're going to study people who've been subject to this much state violence, violated in such an extreme way, and you're going to ask them to tell them the story of your lives, then you want not only the kind of ethical work to be something that you put at the center and at the foreground, but also the writing itself to be something that is part of that ethics. So something where the reader comes away, and hopefully that comes across in the book, and you sort of feel like you've actually learned something about someone. You've got some human complexity. You recognize them. You can sort of imagine them, and in the way that good non-academic, non-fiction and fiction writing works with character, to try and take that seriously. And that seemed like the right way of doing this particular project. I know people do, I'll get the NGO in Jamaica to set up interviews for me, and I'll interview, 3 people a day, and I'll get 120 interviews, and then that'll be more people or something. But I just, being in Jamaica was hard. Meeting people in that situation was hard. And for me, it seemed like the best way as a project of writing, as an ethical and political project, and as something which responded to and took seriously what people were going through, to kind of do this mode of writing, which involved, presenting portraits, not pictures. But you'll see there are some pictures in the book, and then there's the deportation discs, which is a kind of sonic audio conversation. And so there's an attempt to capture people's fullness, I suppose, and complexity.
And one of the other ways, I guess, in which you capture people's complexity is by thinking through the ways in which they describe their experiences or their environments, or the people they've interacted with. And I really enjoyed some of the ways in which you effectively displayed how people were conceptualizing their experiences, were conceptualizing either their own experiences of deportation or the friends or families of people who'd been deported, how they conceptualized racism and deportation. And so one of the friends of one of the people of one of the people that you interviewed, Lewis, says the only time I would say that racism came into it, in fact, of Dylan's situation, where don't get me wrong, obviously what Dylan was just Dylan in it. He messed up, because obviously he done what he done, but at the same time the police made sure that what happened to him, that happened to him. Does that make sense? They made sure that they got rid of him, if you know what I'm trying to say. So if you're talking about racist in that sense, racist in the sense that how much force the police used against us, how much they pressured us. And so I really like, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which you unpick what it is that people are saying and how they're understanding these situations to better situate and help us all to better understand these processes of racism and state power.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, so that quote is kind of when Louis is kind of working through a difficult question. I said, you know, what do you think racism, how would you describe what racism has to do with the fact that your brother / cousin was deported? And he said, I wouldn't really put it down to racism, because it's not just racism, because we have Black British friends who experience the same harassment from the police, but they don't end up in a detention center and being deported. So it's not just racism, it's something also about your passport and being illegal, he said. But then I suppose the police were racist. So he's trying to work out what's his definition of racism, being asked with this quite complicated question, which is is this about racism, basically? And not in a kind of accusatory way from me. You know, we've spent quite a lot of time together. We're in his car doing deliveries for his restaurant, so we know each other a bit. And I'm really interested in those ways in which people try and make sense of stuff, because I think if you listen to people and different people, you can see how they're wrestling with really complicated questions, but also what different things they emphasize, which help us understand, for example, the relationship between the police being racist and the fact that that affects all of your people you hang around with, most of whom are Black, but not all. But so the police harassed all of us, kind of thing. But only me and Ricardo experienced this threat of deportation, and in his case, deportation. So what is it, racism, or is it something else? What's citizenship got to do with it? What word do we have for that? And I think that is what I deal with in one of the chapters, is trying to say, you know, what are these different people saying about some similar things? And so I suppose this comes back to a kind of what in academic-y terms I'd call a kind of methodological point about why you do ethnography. And partly it's because you're interested in complexity in what people say over time, and partly it's because you're really interested in how people understand their own lives, because you think that might have something to teach you about questions that you can't just read about. You can't just, you know, read critical theory against the news and then you have the answer. Sometimes you might get some different questions and some different answers when you hang out with people and ask them to tell you things, or in anthropological terms, see the difference between what they say and what they do, as well, as another classic kind of reason to do this kind of work. So I was really interested in how people conceptualize racism, police, and immigration, and how they understand those relationships. But I would want to say as well that listening to what people, wanting to listen to people and hear their kind of organic or grassroots theorizing, is not just about saying, and Les Back writes about this really beautifully in The Art of Listening, a book I just mentioned earlier, but I'd recommend it for anyone who's doing social science kind of work at any level. But in that book, in The Art of Listening, he kind of says, the point is not that people understand their own lives perfectly, because if that was true, then, you know, that people don't. People are also struggling to work out everything. So it's not about simply deferring and putting someone's voice forward and saying what he said, kind of thing. It's also reading people against one another, thinking critically, thinking about gaps, thinking about what isn't quite captured, or what partial truth is captured, and what other partial truth might be captured from those theory books you read. So it's not a kind of deference to the purity of experience necessarily, but it is taking people seriously. And I suppose the thing that isn't in the book necessarily, but where I learned so much from the people I spoke to, and feel so honored to have been part of their lives, and to change who I was effectively, to think through the world from different people's perspectives. But at the same time, you know, people did enjoy sometimes me giving the whole like kind of leftist anti-racist stick. I mean, it's not real life. I don't put on a different hat and become a kind of ethnographer who's just asking people questions. I'm also saying, this is what I think. And so I think there's that dialogue that happens in research like this, or that was important to me, that comes with treating people seriously and fully. That means that we're kind of both moving together towards what we might think our analysis is. And for the 4 guys in Jamaica in particular, I think that's certainly true, that I was talking to them about what my ideas were about how to make sense of their lives throughout. And that there's no distinction, there's no clear or neat line between real life and the research and the interview. And that makes, hopefully, for something that's part of what that fullness and complexity is in the book, I hope, that comes through, because that's definitely what the story of the last few years is for me.
So I guess we're all kind of familiar with Britain being described as multicultural. It's kind of something we all accept without too much argument these days. But you use this term in the book, multi-status. You describe Britain as multi-status. Can you talk a little bit about that term and what you think it helps us to see? You're on mute, you're on mute.
Yeah, so multi-status. I mean, I think I was just trying to coin a clever term because I'm an academic. But the point of multi-status for me was that, I mean, I read a book that was really interesting and about education called Multi-Racist Britain, and that stuck with me. So we have multicultural, and if you read some of the kind of sociological literature, tends to be on urban studies and racism, you have the word multiculture. So multiculture is slightly different. State multiculturalism is the kind of policy of managing one way of managing difference. Multiculture is the kind of more unstable, kind of multiple complex sets of intercultural exchanges, which produce something like London's multiculture. And then you have multiracial, multi-ethnic Britain. These tend to be a bit more policy terms, multi-ethnic. And then multi-racist, I thought was just an interesting turn in that. Is a book from the 80s about Britain being multi-racist and looking at different ways in which it was racist in different institutions. And my point, I suppose, was that as someone who'd been studying migration, people subjected to immigration detention, people reporting, people undocumented, people who grow up in the UK but aren't citizens and therefore can't access services because of the hostile environment, people who can't go to university on home fees despite having been here since they were 2, that there's a kind of multiplication of both the number of people who aren't citizens and therefore are subject to immigration control, and that's going to go up a lot when we leave the European Union fully. I know we've left, but when those 3 million people status changes. So there's a multiplication or an increase in the number of people who are no longer citizens and who are subject to immigration control, and then a multiplication of the kinds of statuses they have and the kinds of conditions and the kinds of webs of control and surveillance that are enacted against that whole population of what is 5 million non-citizens and 2 million non-EU citizens who live in this country, that we know that roughly. So my point was kind of, I'm aware of the immigration policy side, and I'm aware of the literature on multi-racist, multiracial, multiculturalism, multiculture, multiracial that I read about sociology and stuff for my higher education. And so multi-status was a way of saying, well, in this context of Britain being multicultural, multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, we should also be thinking about legal status and the difference that makes. How people's variable immigration statuses and the fact that they're vulnerable to deportation power kind of fracture the other divisions that we use to understand in sociological literature, society, so around race, class, gender, region, age, sexuality. So there's a way in which I was trying to say, if we want to understand this Britain, this incredibly racist, but also culturally vibrant and changing, unfinished, undecided Britain, then we need to be centering immigration status because the state is, and they have been doing for some time. And so how do we begin to think about Britain's multi-status character? Well, one way might be to chat to people who are indistinguishable largely from Black British citizens, but yet who now have been exiled, and to chat to their friends and family, some of whom are also of Jamaican heritage, some of whom aren't, some of whom, people of different ethnicities, including white people who have different migration statuses, and to kind of ask from there, it's the portraits of deportation, but also a kind of portrait of Britain as this place in which kind of anti-immigrant politics and racism get worked through by a set of policies and laws which really implicate what people can do, how they can move, and how they encounter various institutions of the state. So that was the thinking behind multi-status. It's kind of a descriptor that hopefully helps us see some things that we weren't otherwise seeing.
We're going a bit over time, so I'm going to kind of use one of the questions that we've already been asked from someone in the audience. Okay. Someone called Jason has asked us what model or theory of power you use. But that kind of links to a question I was going to ask anyway. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between racism and racism and citizenship on the one hand, and immigration control and kind of global circuits of power on the other.
Okay, so I think Jason's question I find hard to answer, and would probably just tie myself in knots at a level of abstraction which might not be useful for other people. But if Jason wants to send me an email about something more specific, I mean,
before you
yeah.
answer my question, if anyone else has any questions, please do message. You can message me privately on the chat. We're going to have a Q&A now, so if you do have any more questions, please do message me and we can get them over to Luke. But yeah, as I was saying, Luke, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between racism and citizenship on the one hand, and immigration control and movements of control of movements of people on the other?
I suppose this is what the book kind of attempts to offer, is a way of thinking about the relationship between racism and immigration control. And so again, I could enter kind of overly abstract territory here because it's quite a big question. But let's return to why it's important. The reason it's important is because people working on migration, people working in the migrant sector often don't talk about, and I did a master's in migration studies where we hardly talked about racism because, you know, in some ways it was training people to go and work in Geneva in various migration policy kind of, migration studies is quite a policy oriented subject that doesn't think about history or racism. And then people who work on anti-racist questions in various forms, but there are of course so many people who operate under the banner of anti-racism, some liberal, some radical, but tend not to have in the last few years in Britain connected necessarily to migration struggles. And so I was interested in what these two things how they should be thought about together, because they were my kind of coordinates coming up through academic and political life. And I suppose one of the things I was interested in is saying that racism is not a kind of trans-historical force. There's not one racism in one place for all times, but as Cedric Robertson puts it, race itself has all the, he says something like, has all the appearance of stability, but in fact it's kind of mercurial, deadly and slick. So if we're interested in how racism works in a particular time in a particular place, then I think a really useful place to look is the set of laws and policies around migration. So to give an example, moving from an ethnographic kind of point, where I kind of make an argument about how racism gets produced and remade in specific historical conditions. There was a friend of Ricardo, who's the same person we were talking about earlier, the same chapter in the book, who recounted a story when she was a Black British young person who was about 14 at the time, and with a friend who was Albanian, and the police officer said to him, "You think you're black, mate," to the Albanian kid. "Remember, you haven't even got a visa." Right, which is a horrendous thing for a police officer to say to a child. But the thing that interested me in theorizing from that was that the police officer there, in what is a form of racist kind of violence, a racist utterance, is invoking the force of the law in terms of immigration. And so when we're trying to think about how racism and immigration work together, I think it's helpful to think about how meanings around immigration control and specific policies shape how everyday forms of racism play out. And so, the obvious example is the thing we probably will have both heard at some point in our school years: go back to your country, where are you from? These kinds of questions make sense partly because of a set of laws which ask people to constantly prove where they're from and to go back to their countries. And so that simple example of thinking about racist culture, i.e. what racist people being racist do, and the set of laws and policies which are changing and on the move, and how those two things are articulated together is really important. And so the book is an attempt to see at different scales how immigration controls produce what we know of as racism now. So the racist culture around go home, which is familiar and constant, but for the last few years. And then at a bigger scale, kind of how a set of meanings about racial difference rely on people being forced to stay in places of scarcity and not able to move elsewhere. So, writings on blackness and on slavery are really interesting for this, because they always have talked about the relationship between being racialized as black and being in chains. and the Black freedom struggle, therefore, as always having been about the right to move, the right to locomotion, the railroad as freedom. So there's a whole set of ways of thinking about how race is made, as I said at the beginning, how racial difference and racial hierarchy are made by relations between who can move and who can't. So the book is an attempt to think through that at different scales with different stories. And so there's lots of places where that comes up, but yeah, I'll leave it there. So I'll go on for too long.
I've got an even bigger question for you. Laura asks if you can talk about the relationship between, you've already talked about racism and migration a lot, but if you could talk about its relation to other axes of stratification or identity, like gender or sexuality and class.
Sorry, that was in relation to migration control or racism?
Racism / migration control.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I mean, this is like a big debate, of course, in social science and activist circles, particularly, you know, around debates around intersectionality. So I did feel that I was thinking through some of those questions in relation to the border, and I'd say if we go with the multi-status Britain point and stick with citizenship and immigration control and how they're related not only to race or to making race, but to gender, sexuality, class. I do write about that at different points. So, for example, in the Jason chapter, I talk a lot about class. I'll talk more about gender and sexuality now, but the class point, I suppose, is that when people are illegalized and excluded from access to rights and the right to work, then that produces particular class relations and class hierarchies. So, you know, for example, the tragic story in Glasgow from earlier this week is an example of a set of class outcomes being produced by violent borders, no recourse to public funds. And also that the arguments for immigration control tend to be based on the idea that there's not enough to go around, that the state only has so much, that people take what they don't deserve, and that's the kind of class politics around austerity that gets justified in relation to immigration control. So class is there. Gender and sexuality came through in the book quite a lot because I suppose because a lot of the people in the book were deported not only as criminals and illegal immigrants, but also as people who had attempted to prove their right to family life and failed. So within the immigration regime, what you see is a set of policies which regulate what the family looks like or should look like, what a proper, I mean, in Home Office language, our quote is that if you want to apply on the basis of family life, you have to prove a genuine and subsisting relationship between a partner, or genuine and subsisting relationship with a qualifying child. So in that way, sets of relations between adults and children, sets of relations between partners who tend to be, it tends to be easier if you're heteronormative or heterosexual. But not all, but in fact, heteronormative is a better word because that refers to actually fulfilling the ideal of a kind of nuclear family model. So a lot of the people were deported who I met who had children, but they might not have had children. They might have had children with more than one person. They might not have been cohabiting with the other parent. They might have been separated. They might have spent time in prison, which meant that they weren't present. They might not have been financially supporting a child. So there's a whole set of norms around what a responsible man and what the care of children looks like and what kinds of bodies do it. What, you know, the ways in which women can be protected from deportation sometimes through their relationship to the children, but will then also be demonized for their apparent fertility or, you know, having anchor babies. And we see, for example, in the Republic of Ireland, which celebrates its referendums on gay marriage and on abortion, in 2004 had a less remarked on referendum in which 4-1 voted to strip birthright citizenship because of a moral panic about female asylum seekers having children and using that as a way to stay. So there's an example, right, of where immigration policies and laws around citizenship are directly motivated by and then produce sets of relations around gender and sexuality, particularly in relation to people rearing and bringing children into the world and in relation to people's kind of domestic and sexual relations in terms of family. So that's all there, and there's some really good literature on that I used in some of the later chapters to try and make sense of how it applied to these, in my case, mostly men.
Rinku asks if you could elaborate a bit on how the network of university workers, NHS doctors, school teachers, and others cooperate in the system, which provide more kind of what I might call creative ways of negotiating around the so-called humanitarian approach to the border regime.
I don't fully understand the question. Sorry, can you? I know you're partly reading, but.
So I guess the question is about how people who work for, in healthcare or education or other kind of public sector, how they can be complicit in the border regime. I don't know if it's something you explicitly discuss in the book, but it might be something you're familiar with.
No, I mean, some of these policies were coming in as I was kind of getting into the book. So the hostile environment, Theresa May announced it in 2012, but really 2014-2016 Act, when it starts to kick in, and the people I met were deported in 2013, 2014, and Danica in 2015. So there's a way in which I'm a bit late for the hostile environment itself, even though then Windrush happens and suddenly people care about deportation to the Caribbean. So the work isn't that much about that. The ways in which these people whose life stories are traced in the UK experience borders were generally through new arrangements with the police, the criminal justice system, and the border guards working together, sharing information, new arrangements within prisons, which led to them being deported. But the point that's being referred to there, I suppose, is that now everyone is being transformed into a border guard where everyone is checking and being checked. And so, I'm sure me and you, Adam, have both probably rented a property and applied for or got a new job in the last few years and had to give a passport in. You might not think about it. We've also been asked as teachers to take registers in the university, hospitals charging, hospitals asking for addresses and doctors asking for addresses and verifying NHS England sharing their databases with the Home Office, and the average pregnant person being charged $5.5, $6 for what would be considered a normal birth. So these kinds of things have not only made the border central to all public institutions and turned us all into kind of checkers and being checked. They are part of what explains how people in the situation of the guys that I met now get propelled towards detention and deportation. And so if you see a decision letter now, so say on someone who's, failed their application on human rights grounds, when they've got a criminal record and there's a notice of intention for them to be deported by the Home Office, it will say, you can appeal or whatever, but here's the list of things that you will be excluded from. And that means if you try to apply for work, you'll be breaking the law. If these crimes around illegal working and renting illegally and setting up a bank account or applying for a driver's license. So this is the hostile environment, and it's not that much in the book, but it's an important part of the story now, and one that a lot of people have been working and struggling against, and we can name some of those organisations if people want.
So a question here from Ishan, which is, I guess relates to what you were saying before about how there's this kind of divide between people talking about anti-racism on the one hand and people talking about migrant solidarity on the other. And Ishan asks if one of the reasons that anti-racist thoughts doesn't influence migrant solidarity or the literature around migration very much is partly because a lot of it, or the more recent literature, is being influenced by US thinking about black politics or blackness or anti-black racism, which might not necessarily think about the importance of borders in the way in which it might be useful to in this country.
It's a good question. I'm just going to say briefly that I sort of got halfway into naming some of the organisations that have been challenging the hostile environment, but Sanaz, a friend and comrade, has just posted to everyone about Docs Not Cops and Unis Resist Border Control. So if people want to know more about some people doing some resistance work, I mean, I'm sure quite a few people here do already know about them, but it's worth giving them the boost they need at all times. Ishan's question. I think that's one of the reasons, but I think there are quite a few. So I suppose I wouldn't want to get into the kind of, this is because we spend all our time on Twitter and, the US dominance in the media means that we start to think in the frames from the United States, which of course has lots of revolutionary potential and inspiration for us historically and now, but also leads to particular certain things aren't seen. And I understand that point if we use US frames for thinking about anti-racism and what racism is, then we might miss what's going on closer to home. I share that. But I think the other reason why, I mean, again, anti-racists aren't in one camp. I mean, they really aren't. We spend a lot of our time frustrated about people who do anti-racism differently. So I would say that one of the reasons anti-racists aren't going to talk about borders is because, I mean, it's partly a big theoretical question about how groups who do various kinds of work get integrated into state structures where they are working on certain issues which concern citizens, which concern the outcomes for people who are members in this political community. So, you know, one of the dominant ways we've learned to think about racism is in terms of structural. I mean, this is even the better stuff, right? Not the stuff that focuses on only on the purely interpersonal or the kind of bigotries or intolerances of the far right or something that focuses on the structural material realities for Black and brown people in this country. We still have a problem even in that literature and that work in the set of policies that focus on, say, education and the ethnic, the kind of ethnic penalty in education or in employment or housing, is we haven't really dealt with the question of what happens to those people who are not, don't have those rights to access those things in the first place. And so the question about who is it we're talking about when we're talking about racism in this country? Are we assuming that we're talking about British nationals, and why? And I think that has happened over time. And I can't trace the story perfectly, but I think that can't be unrelated to the ways in which opportunity structures are presented for different groups to apply for bits of funding, to have certain, you know, aims and goals and policy initiatives and mission statements, and receive money from grants and foundations and government pots of money. So I think there's a broader challenge, which is perhaps less kind of sexy than talking about whether we're using the wrong discourse from online, and that's coming in over here, which is not untrue, and perhaps sometimes about a deeper set of questions about who are we imagining, who are we fighting for, and what are we kind of saying about those that don't even have those rights in the first place. And I think these stories in the book should hopefully make that clear, that the problem is how we think about what country it is we're in and the kinds of people who are subject to racism here. Because if they've not got British citizenship, all of a sudden, and this is what happens in people's personal lives, a whole different set of questions emerge about what will be the consequences of police harassment, for example, or what would be the consequences of, you know, the grade fiasco, for example, what would be the consequences of falling ill, or being evicted from your house. So I think that the reason we need to make these connections is because if we start to build politics that takes the stories of people who are illegalized or undocumented migrants subject to various forms of racism, we'll probably build kind of more radical movements that can be working for more people than if we imagine that everyone's got a stake when they haven't.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our hour now, so I guess we should probably begin to wrap up. So I think we'll probably take one more question, if that's all right. What do you think, Luke, or shall we take a couple more?
I mean, I don't know. People can leave, so let's do a couple more if you think there's a couple more good ones. Like if people, I won't be offended as I see the participants go. I don't know.
Okay, so there are two people who have asked kind of related questions, and it's about asylum seekers or migrants in Britain, and they're wondering if you could talk a little bit about the destitution, and I think there was a recent case of a person of Ugandan heritage who died because of they weren't able to access the means of survival effectively by the border regime. And I wonder if you were interested in working on these types of topics in the future, or whether you can elaborate on how those things are connected to the research you've already been doing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important and connected stories, I suppose, and I think that. I mean, so for example, one of the people in the book was in this situation. I mean, two of them were people who were overstayers, who had no recourse to public funds and were not able to work, couldn't access any, for what they're worth, benefits in this country, and were excluded totally. from all social and political rights. So there are two people in the book, and others mentioned too, who fall into that category of being destitute, having no recourse to public funds, being undocumented. I think it's important to say, I suppose, that the critical thing we can get from looking at people's life stories is to see not the undocumented migrant or the illegal migrant as a kind of type of a person. I think one of the things that people imagine when they hear about illegal immigrants, and I'll use scare quotes throughout, is that those are people who entered clandestinely, they entered under the radar, and then remained illegal immigrants, remained people who are categorized as illegal immigrants. But actually, the immigration regime works by illegalizing people in different ways at different times. And the vast majority of people who are considered illegal immigrants are people who arrived here legally and overstayed, or their asylum claim failed, or whatever it might be. Or they committed a crime and they lost their status. So I wouldn't draw a sharp distinction between the destitute, no recourse to public funds, illegal immigrants, the foreign offender, and the person in the asylum system. I mean, lots of people are all of these things at different times. So yeah, quite a lot of people I have met or have kind of worked with in the UK context of Jamaican nationals with criminal records who sought asylum, or Jamaican nationals without criminal records who sought asylum. So I guess I'd want people to think about these groups as not distinct, and sometimes it is again the funding structure that means that you have a project funded by the National Lottery or whatever it might be to work with asylum seekers and refugees. I don't know that it's necessarily helpful to draw a line around that, to kind of reify that grouping as though it's completely distinct from other groups of people. So yeah, I have worked with in the past, and I mean, as lots of the kind of migrant sector groups have written about, this policy of no recourse to public funds, this policy of rendering people destitute as a matter of kind of routine immigration policy, the hostile environment which effectively tries to deny people the means of life, deny people access to healthcare, to housing, to work, to benefits, to opening a bank account, to driving a car. I mean, a very deliberate policy, which Theresa May said when introducing it as Home Secretary, that the hostile environment was designed to create a very hostile environment for illegal immigrants. So these set of policies were designed to create a very hostile environment. I mean, that is, it's murderous, and it has been in its consequences, as has austerity in a slightly different way. So these stories are tragic, and I hope that in response to the recent news, there's kind of new wave of energy around in the struggle that lots of people are involved in to end no recourse to public funds and to end hostile environment.
Okay, so we've got a question here from Laura in Leeds, who asks how we mobilise what she says non-migrants and white Europeans to advocate against the hostile environment policies and anti-migrant discourses beyond simply objectifying black and brown humans as simply bodies. And examples include the recent deaths of a Yemeni asylum seeker in Manchester and other people's making border crossings.
So how can we build solidarity without objectifying?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are a lot of groups who do this kind of direct work with people who do it really well. I'm thinking about, I was returning to read the statements from the Yarswood hunger strikers in 2018, who were supported in part by activists on the outside, but to kind of get their statements out there. And their statements were, full of kind of agency and conviction and politics. So I think there's currently a hunger strike in Brookhouse, and I think someone has just shared in the chat to everyone a petition which everyone should sign about a petition about stopping the charter flights that are booked back to other European countries. So I think there's in response to objectification, I suppose we need to have more complex narratives which center the political activity of people themselves. I mean, people who make it to this country, for example, who travel across Europe. I mean, there's going to be a lot of political energy, wisdom, insight that we can all learn from. So I would say, yeah, the objectification tends to happen with the NGOization of certain things. And I think that the people working with migrants tend to be better, working mutually with migrants at recognizing how people want to articulate their own struggle and their own fight and what it's all about.
We've got another slightly lighter question that someone's asked. What's your fondest memory of being in Jamaica?
Oh, there's quite a lot, actually. I mean, I think I always found it, let's take a detail, I always found it hard going each time I went back, because I was always really excited to see people, and often the situation had got worse for some people. So, you know, people had lost more weight or people were just more stressed. And I found it always like a heavy experience returning, even though I was really glad to see people. But there were lots of moments of real joy. You know, like going to kind of acting tourist in different places and going on a little mini holiday with Danico in Treasure Beach was great. I used to hang around with Ricardo and Pier 1, a bar in Montego Bay a lot, and that was really fun. Spent Christmas with Jason one time and got him a couple of surprise presents and had a couple of drinks downtown. That was really great. So there were lots of moments, sometimes during interviews actually, to feel a real connection when we're just propping up a mic and talking and inviting people to take that time to tell their story. And there were loads of points that were really joyous. And so, yeah, I hope that comes across in the book, that the kind of despair and the hope and the joy and the sadness are kind of circle one another a lot of the time in these kinds of stories. So, yeah. I've got one other question here that I've read. Is there, which is maybe worth answering, is there a sort of reciprocity with people in the book? Do they get any proceeds? When I get proceeds, yeah, they will be totally for what they are. It won't be that much given to the people who feature in the book. And so there's been a lot of there's been a lot of support that's happened, not only from me as an individual, but from working with people's families and wider groups, and that's happened quite organically. So again, this is one of the reasons why doing it with less people sort of ended up being easier, because those relationships are easier to sustain. And as I write in the introduction to the book, a lot of the kind of, I say that, you know, there's as many opportunities for solidarity and care as there are for horrendous abuse and exploitation with this kind of work, given the imbalances of power, which are huge, not only around kind of race, class and citizenship status, but around the symbolic capital of being able to write a book and for other people not to be able to do that. So the kind of ethical and political questions about the relationships with the people in the book are in the pages a bit, but the bigger questions are kind of outside of the pages, and they're ongoing. So yeah, that's always been a this is part of what I mean by real life and politics, and then the kind of research and the book not being totally separate for me, even if they are for the reader. So I'm just checking through any questions in case anyone's missed anything.
So am I. One person has asked what you're going to be researching next. You know yet?
I had an idea to do a project which is kind of on looking at similar kinds of stories, but not only with Jamaican nationals, based on legal reports, on legal files. So sometimes I write expert reports for Jamaican nationals, which is where I provide expert testimony to the court to explain, you know, that perhaps the information they have on how difficult it will be for people in Jamaica is not thorough enough, because there are lots of things they're not taking into account. And this is what my research tells me about why, you know, what happens to deported people. So writing reports for the courts under the instructions of the lawyers working for the individuals facing deportation. And the kinds of stuff you get access to there is incredibly painful. and incredibly rich about how people have to try and produce a case, how they have to try and present themselves, how they try and gather testimony, and then what kinds of things the Home Office say and why. And thinking again about how racism works in that register of kind of bureaucratic decision making and legal decision making. So I kind of got the desire to do something about that with different nationalities, not only with Jamaicans, but also, who knows, as my other kind of thinking is that as the migration statuses of people who are European nationals change, lots of children's charities and migrant charities have warned about the fact that people who grow up in care, for example, and lots of young people are going to find themselves undocumented and subject to these exclusions that we've been talking about and subject to deportation. And so I think there's a lot to be said about just keeping up with what is actually happening and trying to provide some critical framing of that and how that impacts our understanding of race and nationality.
I guess we've got a question that's slightly related to that, which is, I guess, related to kind of positionality, as we might call it, which is asking how you were racialized in Jamaica and how people situated you and how that was related to you navigating different spaces.
Yeah, it varied actually. Sometimes people call me brown man. I mean, in the street, or just out and about, sometimes people call me brown man, sometimes people call me white man. And again, there's a whole conversation to be had about what whiteness means in the Caribbean context, because of course it's so much related to passport wealth as well. So there was a kind of slipperiness to that, and I think that's true with lots of ways of talking about race in Jamaica that are different and really interesting compared to the North American way of talking about, for example. So that happened. I mean, and by the guys themselves, I think a lot of them just kind of, when I said I was half South Asian, half Indian, I think they were just like, they grew up in the UK, so it wasn't very surprising. And Ricardo, for example, his best friend was half Pakistani. So there was a lot more of an immediate understanding about that. It tended to be among people who I met who'd spent a lot of time in the UK, because they kind of were able to read where I fit into the UK a bit, probably class and race wise. But Jamaicans themselves were probably just like, you're definitely foreign and you're from England, so whether I call you brown man or white man doesn't matter that much to me. But yeah, I think with the kind of people in the book, it was normally just having a conversation. I was racialized as brown, I guess.
Slightly different, far less personal question now. Ishan was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the political economy of deportation, charter flights, security, policy making, those types of things.
I feel like this question's a big one, and maybe don't have time to try and go into it for too long, but I suppose partly what you're getting at there maybe is the fact that there's a lot of money being made in these contracts, and so I suppose one of the ways in which I'm more interested in that. So I'm less interested in the theory that the companies themselves are the reason that we have charter flights or the reason that we have deportations is because G4S have worked out how to lobby the government. That might be partly true, but I think there's kind of a confluence of interests, and there's a whole bunch of companies waiting to make money from government contracts in locking people up, including children, and forcing people onto planes. But I think it's kind of an opportunity structure created by racist anti-immigrant politics, which then means there's money to be made. And I think then what's interesting about that political economy is thinking about strategies for resistance, which target certain companies. I mean, London Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants did this really well with British Airways, with Virgin Atlantic, having a go basically, because if people are making money and there's contracts involved, then there's potential to shame them in certain ways, or to challenge them, or to frustrate their ability to make money and to have a certain image of themselves. So that's what, I guess that's the only thing I'd want to focus on with that bigger, broad question about the political economy of exposure. Should we, what do you reckon? I'm just wondering if people are being polite and staying.
I think we've generally answered most of the questions. Some of the questions kind of overlaps a bit, so I have if I haven't answered your read your question, I think it's because we've kind of covered it already in other ways.
People can email me as well if they.
But for Luke's DMs are open, guys. So slide in with your questions. Okay, we've got one final question. You chose 4 men as the 4 portraits that you covered. Can you talk a little bit about that, because there's obviously there's no one who isn't a man who's been deported in your stories, and can you talk a bit about that?
Well, there is one person who's in the Nico chapter, Michelle, who was the only person who would speak to me who fit into the category which I was immediately interested in, which was people who had criminal record and were deported because of that. So there's one kind of reason why the pool of people is smaller, because I was interested in crime, particularly in people who've been criminalized, and because I was interested in people who've been criminalized and then deported. I think in 2013, 85% of deported people were men, and of the foreign offenders, of the people who've been criminalized, that number's even higher. So there was kind of more men around who were, who I managed to contact. And when I did speak to them, I did a few interviews with women, Michelle being the one who's in the book and who's in the article I wrote recently today in Ceasefire, and who I helped write a piece for The Guardian, actually. So she's called Michelle in the book, and that's the pseudonym I used. And there are also women who feature as kind of friends, family, and partners and mothers of the guys in the book. But yeah, I mean, the reason was that there was less people that I met, and then there was also kind of practical sort of positionality questions, really. So with Ricardo, Jason, Chris, Danico, it was a lot of it was like, do you want to just come and we'll do an interview in my flat and hang out? And that wasn't the way that I would have approached. That wouldn't have been a good thing to do, given the power differentials around my access to a flat and all that stuff. So I didn't do that with the people I met who were women, and I did interview a few, but they tend to actually have different stories in terms of their kind of migration histories. A lot of the women I met were older and who I chatted to, and who had actually left Jamaica as adults, not as children. So wouldn't be described as Black Britons, wouldn't make sense, and had migrated to work often in hospitality and care, looking after our children and old people, and in the UK, and had been undocumented and sent money back for their own children to go to school. So it was a whole different story and a whole different set of projects. So I guess one thing that would be really important for people to do to flesh this kind of, if it was just about deportation to Jamaica in general, would be to speak to those people and think about their life stories, which I did a bit but didn't fall into the book. And then also the many people here in the UK who are, for example, Jamaican national women, who are probably in similar situations to some of the guys, but who are subject to no recourse to public funds. That Jamaican national women at one point were the highest national group of people who were claiming, trying to claim benefits under Section 17, which is if you have a British child but you're excluded from all other social rights. So there's an interesting set of stories about illegalized, undocumented, excluded Jamaican national and other national women here who experienced the kind of hostile environment in engendered ways. Yeah, I hope that partly answers the question.
Okay. I think we're coming up to 8:30 now, and I think those that covers almost all of our questions. Yeah. So I guess I just want to say thank you so much, Luke, for illuminating this brilliant book for all of us this evening. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it myself. I'm really excited for it to be going out into the world, because I think it's going to make some really important political interventions, as well as shedding light on the lives of some fascinating and profound people as well. Yeah, very much looking forward to the book getting out into the real world. Out now, everyone, in all good bookshops, but obviously they're probably COVID lockdown, so you have to get it off somewhere evil like Amazon, or maybe not.
Get it from not from Amazon. I'd recommend. I think people who are here are going to get an email about a discount code to get it from the ABP website, so that'd be a bit cheaper.
Okay.
And Hackney Pages and all. Well,
Hackney
sorry,
Pages.
someone's just put Hackney Pages. Look at your local radical bookshop and ask them just to.
Well, I'm sure it'll be available in New Beacon Books. I know do deliveries, so you can probably order it from New Beacon Books, I'm sure, or from the Manchester University Press websites. Thanks so much for having me, Adam. I suppose the longer end question conversation is about how we build around the energy of Black Lives Matter and calls to defund the police and abolish police and prisons, and relate that to wider calls to kind of thinking with these life stories, wider calls to abolish immigration controls, close detention centres and deportations. And I think that conversation is happening, and yeah, you're going to be a big part of driving that. So yeah, let's get to work. Fantastic. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. And yeah, looking forward to the next step.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it.